Welcome to this module of Professor Messer's free Microsoft 7680 certification training course. This module is on BitLocker and BitLocker to go. I'm James Messer, and in this module, we're going to start a new set of requirements. This is the configuring mobile computing section of the 7680 exam. In this module, we're going to look at the things associated with BitLocker and BitLocker to go, including configuring BitLocker and BitLocker to go policies. We're going to look at what a trusted platform module, a TPM, is and how it fits into this idea of BitLocker. We'll talk about startup key storage, and we'll also talk about an incredibly important thing that you need, especially when working with encryption technologies, is how do you recover from a problem if you run into a case where you need to recover this encrypted data. So we'll talk about something called a data recovery agent. BitLocker is a technology that allows us to encrypt entire volumes of information. You may recall from some of our previous videos, we worked with EFS, the encrypting file system. This is one of the nice things about NTFS, because we're able to choose particular folders or particular files and encrypt those so nobody else has access to them. BitLocker takes this to the next level. We can encrypt the entire volume. So if somebody got a hold of your entire disk, they would still not have access to that data, including the operating system and everything else that's written to this disk, because BitLocker would be in place. This is nice. It really protects everything that's on your computer, including the operating system itself. Normally, if you encrypt the operating system, you would not be able to use the operating system. BitLocker does allow you to encrypt the entire volume and protect every bit and byte that might be on this volume. And this becomes especially important for mobile devices because, unfortunately, there are cases where laptops are stolen, laptops are misplaced, laptops are somehow find their ways into the hands of people who should not have these laptops, and you don't want them to have access to the data. Very often, the data that's on the laptop is much more valuable than the physical laptop itself. So one idea is to use BitLocker because this mobile device could go anywhere, and it doesn't matter who gets their hands on this physical device. Your data is always going to be protected. Even if somebody took your drive and moved it to another computer, they would still not be able to see the data. The entire volume is protected. And because it's the entire drive and the entire volume, wherever you move the drive, it's still protected. Nothing changes there. This is only something you could use, though, in Windows 7 Ultimate and Windows 7 Enterprise. Windows 7 Professional and lower versions of that do not have BitLocker enabled as a core capability of the operating system. So if you're planning to do anything with your mobile devices and BitLocker, you need to be sure you're running Windows 7 Ultimate or Windows 7 Enterprise. A term that you'll hear used a lot with encryption technologies on laptops, on portable systems, on desktop systems is something called a TPM. This TPM is called a Trusted Platform Module, and it's a term that we use to describe very often the actual chip that is a TPM chip. Here's one that is made by a company called Infineon. It's a chip that is on the motherboard of your computer. There are also modular motherboards where you could add a TPM module later on if you wanted to. But TPM also stands for a set of standards. The current standard, even as written on this chip, is 1.2. That version of TPM means that everything can write and read these TPM functions to and from this same hardware. It's a very standardized way of doing encryption and using and storing these cryptographic keys for things like BitLocker, among other things. This is also a hardware-based pseudo-random number generator. And if you work a lot with encryption technologies and decrypting of data, you know that random numbers becomes extremely important. And that's one of the nice parts about having this in hardware, is that we can work with these random numbers very, very fast and very, very securely. This also can create a hash key summary of our hardware and software. So if anything ever changes in our computer, somebody pulls out one drive and puts in a different hard drive, somebody modifies something relating to the hardware inside of our computer, we'll have a hash already set up, and this TPM chip can understand if something has changed with the hardware inside of our computer. This is also something that allows us to do platform authentication so that we can query a computer and see if this is actually the computer that we would expect to be at the other end. That's especially important in mobile devices because you don't have that physical control in your building. You want to be sure if somebody's connecting to your network that it's really coming from one of your trusted laptop computers. We'll configure BitLocker in a moment, but I wanted to step through a number of the different modes you can configure for BitLocker. BitLocker isn't one of these things where you just turn it on and it works. There's a lot of moving parts under the hood, and there are a lot of different ways to configure BitLocker. When you configure BitLocker and you have a TPM in your computer, then you're able to configure a mode called BitLocker with TPM. And in this mode, you don't need anything else to authenticate yourself when your computer starts up. It simply recognizes the TPM and it uses BitLocker. There are a number of other things that you can add. For instance, you can add a PIN. That personal identification number allows you to put a PIN number in during the startup of your computer, and it won't unencrypt that data or decrypt the data unless you add that PIN number in there. So you have to have the TPM and the PIN to be able to make this work properly. You've also got the option to use a TPM and a USB startup key. You would have to have that USB key with you and put it into a USB drive for your computer to start. And if you lose that certificate, that key information that's on that USB startup key, even though you have the computer and even though the TPM is storing some of the certificates that you need, it still is not going to work. You need that USB key to have that operate. Again, an additional level of authentication. You can also have BitLocker run without a TPM. You can have that hardware may not be in your laptop. You may not have it in your computer. In this particular case, you must have the key on a USB drive. So you have to have a USB flash drive if you're going to run BitLocker without a TPM. You can see how much we rely on that TPM that's on some of these motherboards to be able to do this. And the most secure one you can do is BitLocker with a TPM on the motherboard. You've got a USB startup key and a PIN number. Obviously, the more levels of this that you add, the more administrative work that you'll need to do. But in environments where there's a lot of security and you're very, very concerned about the data that might be on your portable devices, this is the ultimate in BitLocker security, so that you'd have to have the TPM working on the motherboard. You have to have that PIN number, and you've got to have a USB startup key to have all of this work properly so that you can decrypt and access the information that's on that hard drive. We spoke earlier about the concern of encrypting data, especially in the case where you may need to get access to that data later on, and there's a problem. What if you forget your PIN number? What if you forget your USB key and you still need access to the data? This also becomes important in very, very large environments. If you're in an enterprise, there might be tens or hundreds of people or thousands of people walking around with encrypted data on their laptops. What if any one of them happens to lose access to any of that important security information? How would you as the administrator still gain access to those hard drives? Well, the way you do it is through something called a data recovery agent. This is something built into part of the way that the BitLocker drive encryption works, and we configure it through group policies. This is the group policy area. We'll go into computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, public key policies, and BitLocker drive encryption, and we add a data recovery agent to that. Ideally, we're adding this data recovery agent before anybody configures BitLocker on any of their laptops. This becomes useful because what it does is take that certificate that we're putting out there in BitLocker drive encryption and include it into the encryption that's happening on the hard drive. So this gives you, the administrator, a way to also be able to decrypt that data even if the end user can't do it themselves. You would configure also different drive recovery options for BitLocker. You have a way to configure it for your system drive. You have a way to configure it for other types of removable drives. We'll look at this in just a moment. And you also configure those through group policy. There is also something called a unique identifier. Think about a very, very large enterprise where you might have multiple groups, perhaps around the country or around the world, who might want to have their own section of encrypted private data, and they don't want other parts of the company having access to decrypt or even participate in the BitLocker encryption with that. So every time you set up BitLocker for a group policy object for a certain group or certain set of users or a certain part of the network, then you would configure that with their own unique identifier. And that unique identifier is pushed down and stored on the BitLocker volume. And that's the way that your group policies and anybody looking at that encrypted volume would know what identifiers were associated with it. We'll configure those also in our group policies under Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, BitLocker Drive Encryption, and Operating System Drives. There is a lot of group policy associated with this. and probably more than things that we've done before just because we're encrypting this data. So we have to have a way to get this data back. Now, what if a device was already running BitLocker and you behind the scenes were now starting to set up the data recovery agents? Your machine that is already encrypting data would not know about that data recovery agent. So what you'll want to do is to use the manage-BDE command. That the BitLocker drive encryption command allows you to configure BitLocker parameters at the command line. And you would be able to set an identifier at the command line, and you would be able to pull down the protectors, the data recovery agent certificates, to be able to also include those with the encryption that's being done with the BitLocker that's on that laptop. So it's a multi-step process to get BitLocker configured and ready to go before you even start encrypting drives. But it will be very, very useful to you to have all of this in place if you're ever in a situation where you need to decrypt the drive and for some reason the end user is having a problem. BitLocker is configured by the local administrator that's on a computer. I'm logged in as my domain administrator, so I also have access as administrator on this Windows 7 machine. And I've started up my local group policy editor, and I've moved into that area we talked about under computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, public key policies, and BitLocker drive encryption. And it tells us that we do not have any BitLocker drive encryption data recovery agents defined. We absolutely want to define those. So I'm going to right mouse click on that BitLocker drive encryption, and it gives you an option to add a data recovery agent. It takes you to a wizard that steps you through welcome to the add recovery agent wizard. And it's going to prompt us, and we click next, to add a recovery agent in here. If we have a certificate that's on a drive or a key, I can browse to that folder. I can also browse to keys that I might have on other user accounts. And I'm storing all of my keys in my Active Directory environment. So I'm going to look for the administrator account and simply choose that user, because in that user, I've got a number of certificates that I use under this administrator account. Some are used for authentication, some are used for encryption. And I think it's this one right here. If I look at the certificate properties, this certificate is the one that allows disk encryption. And that's the one that I would like to use right here. And I'm going to make sure that one is selected and click OK. And it adds that recovery agent into the group policy. I'll click next, and it says completing the add recovery agent wizard. And I'll go ahead and click next there, and you can see it is added now, that certificate. And that's all you have to do is have a certificate in place that can be used to recover that data. We can also have other certificates in here as well. We can add any other certs that we might need that could also be used as data recovery agents. Obviously, this is not something you want to give to everybody. This is something you would use whenever you run into a problem. You don't want anybody being able to decrypt data across any of your BitLockered files. So this is something really just for administrators to set up in a recovery situation. Now that we've got our certificate in place, I want to look at my unique identifiers, and I want to make sure that I know what my recovery options will be whenever we work in a recovery situation. Those are in a different area of the group policies. Those are under our computer configuration under administrative templates. There are Windows components. There's one called BitLocker Drive Encryption right there. Scroll back up so you can see all of this tree. And there is a section in here, if I click on BitLocker Drive Encryption, where I'm able to configure a lot of different things. One that I've already configured for my organization is the unique identifier. And this is for my entire domain, but you can make this for a single object within the domain, a set of groups, a set of users. It's a group policy, so you have a lot of flexibility. I'm going to double click so you can see this. I've already set this to enabled, and I've set up whenever I configure something for BitLocker that I'm going to use this identification field, SGC-BitLocker. SGC is the domain that I'm in, and -BitLocker. If you're going to have other areas of the organization, they may have their own identifiers set up in separate group policy objects. So it makes it very, very easy to configure and make sure that whenever you plug in a device or you look at a hard drive, you'll see this identifier automatically in your group policy, and anybody administering the system will know how to handle that. You'll know exactly what area that was set to. You'll know which recovery agents to use to recover the data, a very useful identifier. Also in here are 3 other folders: fixed data drives, operating system drives, and removable data drives. And they have similar group policies. There's a little difference between them. But what I wanted to show you in here for the operating system drives is you can configure exactly how this is going to work. For instance, you can choose how BitLocker protected operating system drives can be recovered. Obviously, this is pretty important for later. We can enable this option and determine how we're going to have this user storage of BitLocker information and how we'll use and save and load information using these BitLocker certificates. This is very, very important to allow a data recovery agent. If we're not allowing that data recovery agent, then we'll have no way to get back in and recover that data if we happen to lose those original pieces of authentication. So you want to make sure you configure those and turn them on for the different types of drives you'll be using. For removable data drives, you may want to do exactly the same thing to choose how BitLocker protected drives can be recovered. And we might also want to look at how our fixed data drive, something that is not an operating system drive, but still a fixed drive in our system. And we can do the same thing to choose exactly how and can make sure that data recovery agent is configured for anything we might plug into the computer. One other policy I'll show you in here, because this will be important for us in just a moment. Under the operating system drives, I've also configured this group policy to require additional authentication at startup. If I double click, you'll see it has an option here to allow BitLocker without a compatible TPM. I'm running in a virtual environment here, and my VM doesn't have access to a TPM module. I just don't have access to one of those. So if I don't have that in my virtual machine, I have to force BitLocker through this group policy to even allow me to do this encryption. Otherwise, it will say, sorry, you don't have a TPM, therefore you can't use BitLocker. Now that you've set up your BitLocker environment, you're going to want to make sure that your end users can start to use BitLocker. And before you do that, remember that we're going to take every file, everything that's on this entire volume, and we're going to encrypt it. So we're going to actually change the configuration of this drive. Most of the time, this is going to be just fine. You're not going to run into a problem with this. But if there's ever a situation where you would want to be able to get back to the original configuration, this would certainly be it. So what you'll want to do is make sure you have a backup. First and foremost, before you do anything, make sure all of those important files are backed up in case you need to roll back to the previous configuration. You would find the BitLocker configuration in your control panel under BitLocker. And remember, you must be a local administrator to be able to do this at all. You're going to want to pick a startup process. So you may want to choose a PIN. You may want to create a startup key. In my particular case, I will have to have a startup key because I do not have a TPM. And remember, if you don't have a TPM, you've got to go in there and configure that require additional authentication at startup, or else you're not even going to have the option to do any BitLocker on this computer. On our Windows 7 device, we'll find this under our Start menu. Under Control Panel, we have an option for BitLocker Drive Encryption. I'll select that. And from here, you're able to configure and set up not just your BitLocker components, but you've also got the ability to configure your TPM right here. I don't have a TPM on my machine, but you can also do administration of the TPM right here in this BitLocker Drive Encryption applet. You've got two options here, BitLocker Drive Encryption to hard disk drives and BitLocker to go. We'll talk about BitLocker to go in just a bit. That's a technology that allows us to encrypt these portable devices like our USB keys. Right now, I want to turn on BitLocker on my hard drive. When I click that, it's going to check the hardware of my computer and determine, do I have a TPM? Is there anything that I need to know about the volumes and configuring it? In fact, it tells me that this computer does not appear to have a TPM. So to use BitLocker, you're going to have a startup key on a USB flash drive whenever you start up the computer. So I'm going to, of course, I can't use BitLocker without additional keys. I'm not even given the chance to require a PIN at this point. I have to require a startup key at every startup and click Next. Since we're telling BitLocker to save our encryption key, it's going to ask where you would like to put that key. We're going to put it on a removable USB drive that I have in my computer now. That is my E:. I'm going to click Save. Let's select it first. Now we'll click Save. There we go. And now I have the option to the process that I want to use to store my recovery key. I want to set a recovery key, and this is different than our startup key. Notice this is the key that you will use as an individual if you ever need to get back into your computer. This is in case of trouble, break glass, grab this recovery key so that you can get back to that data. Remember, we also have a data recovery agent that our administrators can use to get to this data. This is one that I might keep myself, maybe in a safe place in case I need to get back to my machine myself. I can save this to a USB flash drive, to a file. I can also print the recovery key. Maybe I don't want to store it anywhere physical. I want to store it just on a piece of paper somewhere and have it available. I'm going to save it also to my USB flash drive, which is probably a bad idea, but for the sake of the demonstration that we're doing here, I'm going to go ahead and put it there as well. It says my recovery key has been saved. Are we ready to encrypt this drive? The selected drive is C, and we can keep working while this encryption is going on, but it tells us that your system probably is going to slow down just a little bit because it's busy doing that encryption process. You can also do a BitLocker system check, and this will make sure that it's able to read the recovery and encryption keys correctly before it begins encrypting the drive. It's kind of nice. We want to be sure that we're storing these things properly and that when we reboot this system and need that startup key or need that recovery key, that those will be there and available for us. So it does that check, and it's going to restart our computer before it encrypts this. You're going to have this check there. It tells you it might take a little bit of time. It's something you should probably make sure that you have available. Only uncheck that if there's ever going to be a problem reading those particular keys prior to doing the encryption process. We'll click Continue, and BitLocker tells us the computer must be restarted. Insert the USB memory device containing the recovery key and restart now. As BitLocker is doing its encryption, we'll get a dialog box that tells us here's how far we've gotten with the encryption process. And of course, we've still got access to the operating system. We can do the same things we were doing before. Just remember that we may have a little bit of a performance decrease as this encryption process is going on. Once our encryption is finished, we get a dialog box that says the encryption of C: is complete. Let's look at the status of that from the command line. I'm going to click and do a CMD with a Control-Shift-Enter to get an elevated prompt and choose yes. And I'm going to run the program manage BDE, and I'm going to use the -status option, and it will show us, if I scroll up a bit, the E drive, which is our 2 gig flash drive that I have in. It is a decrypted drive. That's not one that we configured with our BitLocker encryption. But later on down the page, we can see our volume C: is here. That's our 60 gig drive running Windows 7. It is fully encrypted, 100%, gives us the encryption method, and it does show the identification field of SGC BitLocker. So if we did come across this drive and we were wondering, what particular drive is this? Where did this come from? We can see if that identification field is one that we would recognize from those group policies that we set earlier. We've already seen the reference of BitLocker to go when we were configuring the primary BitLocker of our hard drive. BitLocker to go was created so we could have the same type of encryption technologies, but only on our portable devices. That's the to-go piece. And that's because it's much easier to lose one of these USB keys than it is to lose an entire laptop. It's much easier. In fact, my USB key is connected to a key ring that has my flashlight on it. It has my PayPal token generator. So I know that I've got it all together in one place. If I lose all of those, I'm in real trouble. But that's why we have BitLocker to go. So if I do lose that USB key somewhere, I know the data on there is all encrypted. I don't have to worry about it. BitLocker to go works very similar to our BitLocker process. There are a set of policies that are specific to removable data drives. We've seen that earlier, and we can control exactly how BitLocker is used on those drives. We may set a policy that says if you plug in with the USB key, it must be a drive that is set to have BitLocker encryption enabled. Otherwise, you aren't able to copy any data to it. That's just another way to protect that very important data from getting into the hands of someone else. We've all forgotten a password before. We've all forgotten our PIN numbers. We've all forgotten things and weren't able to remember exactly what those were. And if you forget your PIN, or you perhaps leave your USB startup key somewhere, you're not going to be able to get into this BitLocker drive. So you need some way to recover whenever that happens. So what you want to think about is what type of recovery mode you have available. If you have your recovery key, and that was created when the BitLocker drive was created, then you're able to get the information right from your USB key, plug that in the recovery mode, and it'll be able to put you back into your drive with that recovery key in place. Now, since we've also got all of this information stored in that recovery agent on our Active Directory services, we can use the Manage BDE to give us a status of that drive. We know what recovery agents were used with that drive, and we can unlock if we happen to have the certificate thumbprint of that particular certificate available. That's just another way that we can use to get that data back, because once you are encrypted, there is no way to get back in here without one of those methods. There is no backdoor, there's no secret process. If there was a secret process, you wouldn't be using this particular method. This is a foolproof encryption method, and if you don't set yourself up to recover it, then all of that data will be lost forever. Remember that you can find all of your BitLocker to-go policies under your computer configuration, administrative templates, Windows components, BitLocker drive encryption, and under the removable data drive group policies. You can control the use of BitLocker on removable drives, which means you can allow users to apply or allow users to suspend and decrypt BitLocker protection, or a combination of those. You can configure the use of smart cards on removable data drives. Maybe you have to have a smart card to be able to enable this encryption when you're using BitLocker with BitLocker to go. You can deny the ability to write to devices that are configured from a different BitLocker organization. So you have to use your particular mobile encryption devices. You could choose to deny write access to removable drives not protected by BitLocker. So you could choose that somebody may not write to a USB key unless it is one from your BitLocker organization. And that's that organization ID that allows us to determine that. That's a handy use of that particular ID. We can allow access to BitLocker protected removable data drives from earlier version of Windows. Those are ones that have that FAT formatted removable drive. That is definitely an earlier version of Windows. We can configure the use of passwords for removable data drives and the complexity of the passwords themselves. And lastly, of course, we can choose how BitLocker protected removable drives can be recovered. That was one of the policies we set earlier before we did our BitLocker encryption. Let's review some of the topics we covered in this module. Our first question: which policy allows BitLocker to be enabled if no TPM is found? You may need this occasionally, especially if you work with a lot of virtual systems. Just remember that the policy we're looking for is require additional authentication at startup. The next question: which BitLocker mode is the most secure? You recall we went through a number of those different modes that you might need with BitLocker, and the one that's most secure is the one that has the most number of options in it. BitLocker with a TPM, a USB startup key, and a PIN associated with it. And our last question: which BitLocker feature allows you to recover data from any of your encrypted volumes in your organization? And if you're planning to roll out BitLocker, you're certainly going to want to set one of these up. That's a data recovery agent. That covers our requirements for this video. We've gone through both BitLocker and BitLocker to go. So we know now how to manage the policies associated with BitLocker and BitLocker to go. We know how to manage trusted platform module pins. We've looked at recovering and configuring the startup key storage. We've done that on our BitLocker, and we've talked about using the data recovery agents and supporting those. If you'd like to watch any of our absolutely free Microsoft videos, you'd like to send me a message, you can participate in our message boards, and so much more, you can visit our website at professormesser.com.